Hello, welcome to this interview from the Herbert Howells Society. I'm Jonathan Clinch. Today it gives me great pleasure to be interviewing Philip Moore, a long-standing member of the Society. Philip has had a very prestigious career as a composer. He was director of music at York Minster. Before that, he was director of music at Guildford Cathedral. And before that, he was assistant cathedral organist at Canterbury Cathedral. And he studied at the Royal College of Music. Philip, welcome. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to you. I wonder whether we could start with your musical beginnings. I know you're writing an autobiography at the moment as we speak, so I've been thinking about these things a lot, and that's a good place to start. And I wonder where Herbert Howells came along.
I was just thinking, because I've been composing since I was in single figures, and it was mostly Bach watered down, and then I got to know the St. Matthew Passion very well and the organ pieces, and it was all watered down Bach, and then I discovered Vaughan Williams, and that was a game changer. It was particularly the Fifth Symphony, and then I can remember the spot in the house we were living in Maidstone at the time when I heard the Te Deum, the Howells Te Deum, and I was rooted to the spot. And then I came to know the four anthems, Like as the Heart. I heard at Gloucester on one occasion, um, and my first essay in a sub Howells style was when about 1959. I suppose I was 43, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, about 17 or 18. And it was a setting of the carol, the Lute Book Lullaby. And it was total howls in my sort of estimation, as I thought. But it was mirrored very much on Like as the Heart with the soprano solo, dee, 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 that sort of thing. And then, of course, I went to the RCM and Alan Ridout got me out of all that. But I have to say that I was a disappointment to him um, because he once said, I came to the lessons with so many very good ideas, but never quite seemed to carry them out because I was so concentrating on organ playing. Um, and I wrote some things when I was there. Um, and subsequently. But what he said to me in later life um, was that I've got a letter from him somewhere. I got it somewhere. He said, given your progress at the RCM, I had no idea that you would write so much in subsequent years. And this is just the way these things turn out. Um, because I think when I was in Canterbury, um, well, I did write quite a lot in Canterbury, especially for men's voices. And Alan Wicks was very good at encouraging. And he liked the sort of slightly thin textured stuff, which Alan Ridout had sort of tried to get me to write. And and then it was really when I went to Guildford, I started writing more. I think partly because I let the organ playing go a little bit when I was at Guildford because I was concentrating on the choir. And I think the composition sort of took off from then really. And I remember playing Alan Ridout my organ concerto and a big piece called De Profundis, which is about half an hour in length. It's a cantata, and which I'm actually in the middle of putting into Sibelius. Um, and it doesn't have many hints of Howells at all, but I'm trying to write a Te Deum at the moment, and it's actually proving very difficult because I just so want to reproduce what Howells used to do, and yet it would be a pale imitation. So, but he's a constant reference point, and the more I've got to know the other works of his, I mean, Hymnus Paradisi. Um, I remember hearing that in Gloucester years and years ago and thinking it was absolutely wonderful. And it was last heard at the Proms in about 2015 or something, and it was absolutely wonderful. I remember the applause went on for so long um, that the following night prom, which was, I think, works by Eric Whitaker or somebody of that ilk, and it started really late. Now, my mind is just whizzing around, as you can see. Have you ever seen an article about Hymnus Paradisi by Simon Heffer?
Yes, yes. We're talking about the one where he was basically shaming the proms and saying, "Come on, it's time to have a performance." Quite shortly before the proms actually did it. Are you talking? Is that?
Well, the article that I saw in the Telegraph, we don't see the Telegraph, I'm afraid, but my father-in-law used to cut out anything interesting. And Simon Heffer was making the case that the Hymnus Paradisi was one of the finest choral works that has ever been written by an Englishman. And he said, I say that bearing in mind Gerontius um, and the War Requiem. And I could see why he said that. And in fact, I think I wrote to him and said, well done. I gather that he got a bit of stick for that, but I think it was a wonderful article. Um, that was the case I think um, he he made, and he'd heard a performance of it in King's College, Cambridge, in the chapel, and he remembered Howells. He was still alive then, coming to take a bow after it, and thinking this amazing man. And he went in a little bit on about his um, interest in the fairer sex, as it were, which never stopped, as we know. Um,
Interesting, isn't it? I mean, recently we've had a kind of bubbling up of interest in hymnists. There've been performances all around the country, including one in Guildford, and um,
yes.
the fabulous one at the three choirs that I was able to be present for. So I think we're at a kind of golden time for that, and it's also
Mm.
interesting that Ian Parrington has done a reduced orchestration so that people
Has he?
have been able to do it if they're on kind of slightly smaller budgets and
Yes.
trying to organize a recording of that so that more
Yes.
people are aware of this slightly more flexible setup. It was very interesting watching the rehearsals this year for three choirs because we've now got a situation where obviously the performance in Hereford kind of mirrored the one that happened at the Three Choirs shortly after the premiere. You know, it was
Mm.
premiered in 1950, but in the two subsequent years, it was so popular that they redid it immediately in Hereford and Worcester. Um,
I didn't know that. Yeah.
and
Mm.
so and then in the fourth year along came the Missa Sabronensis. So but it's interesting. I was sitting there in Hereford thinking, well, yes, this is mirroring this performance in the early 50s.
Mm.
But of
Mm.
course now the chorus is about half the size for various reasons.
Yes.
But at
Yes.
the same time, actually, Adrian Partington, particularly as a kind of former Howells pupil and a very, very fine conductor, I think was able to give it a kind of dexterity with a smaller chorus that
Yes.
I suspect
Yes.
we wouldn't have had with double the number.
No.
It had a
Mm.
kind of rhythmic vitality. So I was sitting there wondering, are we experiencing the finest hymnist performance ever? Because just almost kind of serendipity that this is the world has changed and choral performances have changed and festivals have changed, but actually the way that it is how hymnus has adapted and musicians have adapted brings a kind of new life to Howells. So I
Yes.
wonderful that there's a kind of living tradition there.
Mm.
And that we've got kind of renewed interest. But yeah, I still believe that Hymnus is a very fine work, but it's also one. It's interesting that you were immediately taken by it because it's also one that I've had to really work on. And
Right.
the Missa Sabronensis for me was much more enjoyable, and I think it was because I felt because it was the mass text and it had that
Yes.
symphonic nature, the way in which
Mm.
it comes back. It kind of held together. And I remember hearing Hymnus first and thinking these are six beautiful pieces, but I can't quite understand the connection. Um,
No. No.
I think you have to really work at it, but
Yes.
definitely worth the work, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I think um they're the opening is fantastic, and you once drew the analogy to the start of Gerontius, which is obviously very similar. Um, but also that there's a place where, and my cup shall be full. There's a wonderful sudden key change, and I think that is one of those magical moments in it. And then I think the language is easier to assimilate than, say, the Missa Sapronensis, um, which is a fine piece, but I don't know it so well. I've actually got to listen to that more, and also the Stabat Mater, which I heard the first performance in the festival hall, and we came away a little bit bewildered because it was very much Howells, but quite tortuous. I find. I mean, it's a very tortuous text. I've said it myself. um,
Yeah,
but
it's interesting. I wonder if you could reflect a bit more on what's driving you as a composer, because interestingly, you've had success as an organist and a conductor and a cathedral musician, and you're very comfortable being a church music composer, aren't you?
yes, oh
I was
yes,
just
yes,
wondering, what do you think how's a kindred spirit in that sense, or perhaps something really quite unusual, because I see Howells very much as a musician who went to the college as a composer, who was writing two piano concertos quite early on, a lot of chamber music, and
yes,
came to church music really quite late in a major way.
yes, yes,
Um, and actually, he didn't see himself as a church music composer, of course, and he was always quite confused when people were so fixated on his church music. I wonder how that relates to your own kind of self-expression as a composer, and how that defines it, and what really you're seeking to do. Because that kind of basic question of why write choral music, what are you trying to
yes.
do? And
Oh, I suppose the answer to that question, let's see. I think what I'm trying to do is actually to write, if it's a commission, I'm writing what people would like, um, would be able to perform well. One of the problems of any commission is that people sometimes fix on a piece of mine which they like, and they almost hint, can you write something, say, like "All wisdom cometh from the Lord," which is one of my most performed works for some reason. Um, and they want something like that. And that's actually a bit of a limitation. One of the recent commissions I've just done is for a choir in America, the choir of the cathedral in not I can't remember where it is now. Um, it's not Charleston, somewhere else. Um, they had a person commissioning, and I've done several commissions, and he's quite specific about what he wants. And in fact, he since gave me some words, and he wanted it based on uh, a song, whatever it is, dee, 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 bum, ba, bum, bum. And that actually focuses the mind really well. And I suppose this today in my writing, it's for a garter service. So it's got to be accessible to people who aren't necessarily musical. Um, but as a writing for a Te Deum, I've listened to lots of Te Deums in order to try and get a focus. And it's very hard to, obviously the Howells is in my mind, but there's one by James, or there are two by James Macmillan, which are both very interesting. One, the Edinburgh Te Deum, um, which is almost like plain song, is in Latin. And then there's another one which starts very, very, very softly, and then goes slightly bananas. You have suddenly have these amazing organ bits, and I think one of the problems with the Te Deum is that if I start it softly, people will immediately see, you're copying Britain in E. And if I write something with a slow middle section, you're copying Britain in C. So uh, it's a very, very tricky thing to do. But I think I've written quite a lot of music other than church music. I mean, there's a lot of organ music, as you probably know. And also, something I did in lockdown, I wrote a piece for variations for organ and brass on the tune York. La, 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 la. As something to do in lockdown because commissions dried up because choirs weren't singing. And there's an organ concerto, and there are a variety of cantatas, De Profundis that I've mentioned. And I've written a bit of chamber music too. I wrote some time ago, I wrote a flute quartet with flute, violin, viola, and cello. Um, and like Alan Riddart, I'm actually not a very good parent of my compositions. I tend to write them and slightly forget about them. And what else is there? Oh, there's a Cor Anglais sonata. Um, and I've enjoyed my excursions into non-choral writing, really very much indeed. Mm.
Interesting. Do you see the organ works within the church? I mean, the reason I ask that is the number of times Howells said things like the Rhapsodies were an experiment at getting away from the church, and I think this was
Really
it was kind of
interesting.
it was all about expanding the musical horizons of the
Mm,
instrument. I wonder
mm.
whether you see your organ works in the same manner.
It depends what I'm writing. I think Tim Rogers has published several pieces. One called Via Crucis, which is
This is
based on.
Encore Music Publishing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, based on words by Eric Milner White, which actually came in very useful during the lockdown over Easter in 2021, because we just need an organist and a reader. And there's another one, Via Lucis, which is about a poem about light, and I've done reflections on that. So those pieces are specifically church orientated. Um, but a lot of the organ music is not necessarily so. I mean, the organ sonata, which had a bit of an outing, um, that's very much not church based. In fact, it was originally um, three reflections on words by D.H. Lawrence. Um, and then I felt that was a bit obscure, so I decided just to convert it into a sonata.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Mm,
It's interesting when a second ago you talked about the Te Deum by Howells.
yes,
And I suspect that if he was here, he would say, well, he wrote quite a few Te Deums, and it's one of the things I was fascinated in being an academic was the comparison and just how different, say, Colruyt, the famous one, is
yes,
from the ones he did, and when you were talking about commissions, I was thinking about the Redcliffe Te Deum and the slight furore when he wrote that. He wrote something exceptionally difficult, having been asked to write a very easy Te Deum, and the I think the
mm,
panic when it arrived and they were trying
mm.
to trying to perform it was considerable. And I think there's a kind of disconnect with the performers a lot of the time because we say a lot Howells is basically what writing for people and places, but actually it's also interesting the way that he wasn't writing for people and places
I
sometimes.
know, I
There are
know.
lots of examples where people people said this is far too difficult, or how on earth are we going to do that?
Mm, mm.
And I'm interested. I was looking at an anthem the other day that he wrote for Hereford Cathedral, that was for a wedding in the Lady Chapel, and he hadn't factored in that the organ wasn't there, and there wasn't an organ in there at that time. But of course, in Hereford, they managed to actually accompany it loudly enough in the nave that the sound carried through. So
Right.
it was kind of it was
Yeah.
there was a fix. But it's interesting that he wasn't always on top of the situation, and I wonder about that with the York service. I mean, when
Yes.
because we have this great big fanfare at the beginning that I assume was intended for the tuba mirabilis and that very famous sound. But of course, that speaks into the nave, and evensong is in the choir, so it doesn't really work like that. Is that do you think that's the case with the York service? I wonder whether you could tell us a bit about your experience with that particular setting.
Yes. Well, um, that was not written for the tuba mirabilis because I think it. I can't think. I don't have a copy in front of me, but I think there were crescendos and diminuendos, and
Right.
there's a tuba in the solo box, and I think he must have been thinking of that. Um, and I think he. I'm just thinking on the top of my head now. I think he wrote for buildings rather than the abilities of the choir. Because if you look at the New College service, which we broadcast shortly before I retired, in fact, I had to play it because it was the girls and men, and John Scott Whiteley was looking after the girls at that stage. Um, and it is written for a building without any acoustic, if you think of the way it's written. Whereas St. Paul's is clearly um, written for a building with a huge acoustic. And that was very apparent actually at John Scott's memorial service, which I went to. And they sang a Bach motet, and it was completely lost. We couldn't hear what was going on, even though the choir was in front of the choir stalls. And then they sang I think the Nunc Dimittis of the St. Paul's service, and you could almost feel the audience or the congregation just settling into the building because it it was for the building. And am I right in saying that Howells called Reg Magnum Nunc was originally started for a trebles only piece? Is that right?
I can't find any evidence for that.
Ah,
Something there are quite a few things in Howell's
mm,
history that people tend to almost like Chinese whispers
mm,
have passed on. It's a bit like the idea that the solo at the end of Like as the Heart was meant to represent Michael. These are all
yes,
very nice stories, which I suspect
yes,
maybe have originated from him, but it's
yes.
very hard to pin these things down in
Yes,
25.
yes,
But you
yes,
did you broadcast the York service, didn't you, during your
we
time?
did.
Yeah.
Um, I looked at it time and time again. In fact, it's online now, apparently. Um, so many of these things are now online. People have been putting these things. So I saw it. It was 1999, and uh, what happened was that I looked at it because I wanted to do it at some stage. And then we had a really good lot of boys at the time. And so we decided to launch. And we sang it at least once or twice before the broadcast. Um, and we had to work very, very hard at it. And we coupled it, it was in Advent, I think, and we coupled it with Vigilate of Bird. So it was really quite a marathon. But it was wonderful. And I felt somebody said to me, I looked as if I was almost taking part in a racing car. I was racing a racing car with my hair sort of everywhere. I mean, it wasn't, but he said he felt when I was conducting it that it was almost a kind of race to get the thing airborne. And Robbie did it not very long ago in the summer, very, very successfully. And he used my copy because I marked it. And apparently, I marked it up very carefully. which I always used to do, especially with the constant time changes. Um, and they did it very, very well. Um, and I think um, it left some people a little bit, what is it all about? But as I think I said too, I think it's Howells on speed. There's every single element of Howells in it that you would ever could recognize. Every bar, just play one bar and you know it's him. And that's one of the extraordinary things about his music, I think, is that it distinctly, um, instantly recognizable.
It's interesting, yeah.
Um,
A lot of people make that point, and I've always thought, well, we could say the same about quite a few composers. I mean, I think
yes,
three notes of Mozart, and I know it's
you
Mozart,
know,
isn't it?
yes, you
I mean,
do.
it's quite, and actually sometimes it's used as a way of actually denigrating Howells and saying, well, oh, actually it all sounds the same. It's oh, why if we've got 20 odd settings, what makes particular ones stand out? But for me, kind of York, I think, is probably one of the most dramatic. Um,
Yes,
and the idea of starting Evensong the Magnificat with this tuba solo, which is quite terrifying. I mean, those unrelated triads, for me,
I
that's
know.
it's kind of Holst of the planets. Um,
It is, isn't it?
it's
Yes.
he's the
I
only
rem
really, I think, the composer that I would liken to that opening. But I don't know. What do you hear?
yeah, I think you made that point when we met, and I think it's a very, very valid point. He is influenced by the drama and the extraordinary effects that Holst gets. I mean, the trouble with Holst, he's a really one-piece composer, isn't he? Because of the planets. But there are Holst's music is quite dark, I think, isn't it?
Mm.
Um, and I think Howells has a darkness to him. Interestingly enough, I told Robbie that the manuscript of the Howells York service is in the Minster Library, and when John Scott Whiteley and I looked at it before performing it, um, we noticed that for York Minster um, it was pasted over something else, and we were rather intrigued to think, was it another Magnificat he'd written for somebody else? And actually, Robbie managed to get some device to see what was underneath. And I think it was just a morning service for York, rather than a mag and not for somebody else. But what was interesting, I think I told you, was that he was commissioned by the Friends, um, and he was asked
It's
for an
the
unaccompanied
Friends of
service.
York Minster Music, isn't it? Yes.
Yes,
And you, yeah,
it was no, it's just the Friends of York Minster,
right.
which is a separate body, but they commission lots of things and they support all sorts of things. And apparently he was asked for an unaccompanied piece. Um, and Geoffrey Coffin went round, he was assistant at the time, went round to Francis and said, "Oh, doctor, I think this is a bit more than we asked for." And Francis did perform it. I heard it once with him playing and John conducting. And this was at a cathedral organist conference in 1976, long before I knew I was coming here. And Francis played it and John conducted it. It must have been pretty hair-raising because cathedral organists from all over the country were there. And they did it very well. But in Francis's autobiography, he's slightly dismissive of it. Um, Francis's autobiography does not contain an index, and it's infuriating because I want to look at things and they're not there. But he said it didn't really um, feature in his time at all, really. And of course, he was slightly suspicious of Howells for two reasons. The first was that he didn't like all of his music because Francis was a very good composer. I think he slightly felt threatened by Howells. And the other thing which made Francis be suspicious of Howells was an event, again a long time before I arrived here. Um, Howells was asked to give away the prizes at the Minster School for the choristers. And Howells arrived. It all went very well, um, and Francis, lovely to see you, and so forth. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, but Francis and David Wilcox um, look not dissimilar. Same build, same hair, slightly receding, and and Howells apparently during the day sort of flipped and started to talk to Francis, calling him David. And I think that infuriated Francis, and went on calling him David until the end of the day. So I think on those two accounts, those two incidences, made Francis very slightly wary of him. And he used to mispronounce his name. He would say Howells. Um, uh, he could. Francis was a master of um, the English language, not only in his choice of words, but also in the ways in which he um, would imply criticism just say by pronunciation.
We and one of my first experiences of the Herbert Howells Society was sitting between Francis Jackson and David Wilcox
Oh my goodness.
at a dinner at King's when we had a joint weekend with the Stanford
Mm,
Society, which was
yes,
wonderful. But it was wonderful to be sat between these two giants of church music,
yes.
who I say were basically misbehaving. I think
I'm sure.
in their
Yes.
80s, and yes, were wonderful. And I think,
In what sort of
as you know,
what
I knew Francis as a teenager and,
yes,
in
yes.
Yorkshire and played to him quite a bit. So I can imagine his humour.
In what ways were they misbehaving?
Oh, well, one of the things I loved was the fact that the after dinner speaker was Jeremy Dibble, who was my PhD
Yes, yes,
supervisor, who I
yes.
know very well. And every so often he would say something, and then David and Francis were basically providing a commentary. Just going, I'm not sure about that, or oh, yes.
Yes.
And the fact that
Lovely.
they, like naughty
Yes,
schoolboys, they were talking at the back of the
yes,
class. So.
yes.
It was rather wonderful, and yes,
Mm,
I
mm,
that kind of the gentle cynicism that Francis had about quite a lot of his music is interesting.
yes, yes.
And yeah, obviously people who are writing a lot of church music as well, and coexisting in all sorts of different institutions and the Royal College of
Mm.
Music, the RCO and things like that. Coming back to the Te Deum, the thing that occurred to me when you were talking there is actually you were talking about the Col Reg one, but do you obviously there's the Howe setting for St George's Windsor. Um,
Which is lovely.
which
I listened to it the other day.
I was going to say, is it one you've dared to listen to, given that you're doing a
Yes,
commission?
it is, and it's wonderful. I like it huge. And there's one for Canterbury, which I was looking at the other day, which we did. I managed to persuade Alan Wicks to do it because he was slightly um, not suspicious of Howells, but he didn't warm to his music in the way that I did, although I persuaded him to look at this Te Deum, and it went down very well actually. Um, and there were one or two moments where there's actual chanting, um, which is actually very effective because it's such a long text, um, and so my today may have a little bit of chanting as well. I don't know, but there's also the yes, you mentioned the Wells today, which is lovely. I don't know the Redcliffe service, um, but I'm sure it's online. Or
Yeah, yeah, it's been
collegiate singers.
the collegiate singing has recorded
Yes.
it. Yeah,
Well, I have
yeah.
that. Yes.
And very in recent times, Andrew Kirk, the then director of music,
Yes.
resurrected it. So they have done it in recent years at Redcliffe.
Right.
I
Interesting.
think
Yes.
they're quite proud of it. It's always got the slight mystery of a certain section that has little quotation marks around it, um,
Right.
and we haven't quite worked out what that's in reference to.
No.
Because I know obviously Howells spent a lot of time in Redcliffe as a boy because his father would come to work in Bristol
Oh, right.
and
Yes.
sometimes dropped him off at the church and left him for hours on end to wander around
Right.
while he
Right.
was
Interesting.
in the city.
Mm,
So he spent a
mm,
lot of time looking at that beautiful
mm,
parish church.
mm. So it's probably written again for a building rather than a specific choir.
Yeah, yeah, perhaps,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Mm.
I wonder. I pick up that moment you mentioned in connection with the Te Deums, and the Te Deum. I mean, there's Howells wrote other ones. I presume you're not aware of the Washington one or
No.
actually the West Riding Festival Te Deum. That's probably the nearest to you in Yorkshire. Is another interesting setting, and but I wonder whether you could say anything because I know that you mentioned Canterbury because you'd been there. You were responsible for choosing music as a director of music at Guildford and then York, and then obviously you were as assistant organist at Canterbury, part of that. And I was just wondering what was the kind of role of Howells's music when you were picking these music lists, and what drew you to particular settings, and what why you would choose a Howl setting over something else.
I think when you're working out the music for a cathedral choir, you want to give them a balanced diet, and you don't want to emphasize any one particular period. Although I tended to avoid too much personal. I'm afraid, partly because I couldn't quite get on with all his music. Loved polyphony, um, the Palestrina masses, the bird masses. We did all three, and but I think when you're choosing music, you have to bear in mind the rehearsal time. That's the crucial thing. Have I got time to teach this to the kids? Have I got time to rehearse it with the men? All that sort of thing. And I think I didn't voice too much howls on them um, for that purpose. And I remember when there was an anniversary. I can't remember when it was. Certainly in my time at York, we did the I think we did the three of the four anthems we have heard with our ears, and "Oh Pray for the Peace of Jerusalem," which I think is a lovely piece. Um, we didn't have the main organ; it was being restored at the time, so we didn't do "Let God Arise," which I would have loved to have done. It's hardly ever recorded, I don't think, is it? Um,
Not as much, no, no.
no.
Some
Um,
recordings on Spotify.
mm,
Especially this
um,
one from Lincoln.
And so I think you're constantly. I mean, I would have been perfectly happy to do Howls every week, but I think um, people would have started raising eyebrows, um, especially um, especially in York when we get big congregations, and I think they would have been a bit. Um, I think they would have said, "What on earth am I playing at?"
Yeah.
But we did the I remember we did the Worcester service in Canterbury, which went down well, and then in York we did the New College service, Colreg, St Paul's, the Gloucester service, and we also did the Howells Westminster service, um, and which I loved. I thought it was wonderful,
It's
and
another one of those very dark settings, isn't it? When
it is. I rather like dark music. I don't know what it says about me. What else did we do? And we did the St John's service. Um, not for, only once or twice, I seem to remember, but I loved it. I think the dramatic end to the Gloria is incredible. And again, this is one of these moments you always remember. I remember hearing it when I was a student and thinking, my goodness me, what a cadence! Those are meant F sharp, no, F major to D major. And actually, we did Howells in G as well, which I think we talked about when we met.
yeah,
Um, because again, that the cadence at the end of the Magnificat Gloria, again, I can remember hearing a recording of it or choral evensong, um, and the way um, he gets right away from G major, um, and then suddenly you get this tremendous burst of the flattened leading note with a D at the bottom, and then the G major chord with the organ playing. I remember playing an A and then resolving to a G, and I would have loved to have rescored it and put that on the altos and really heard that crunch, but I didn't do that.
It's
Mm,
interesting, isn't it? Sometimes Howells is seen as a kind of a modernist in that it's kind of a breakaway, it's a new style in church music.
mm,
And then sometimes we see, I mean, certainly he saw himself within this continuing tradition. Tradition was a word that he constantly used. Um, and of course, when you mention Te Deums, I think Stanford in B flat above everything
yes,
else, to be honest. And
yes,
I
yes.
suspect he did too. And there's a kind of it's interesting that how do we get from the world of Stanford to the world of Howells, and are they how much do they have in common, and how much do they not? And for me, the thing that changes with Cole Reg is almost is a very chant-like approach to meter.
Mm,
So it's
yes,
that kind of
yes,
fluidity, and I've always in my head made the connection with all of those hours spent in Westminster Cathedral, hearing
yes.
plain chant in his early years. Um,
Mm,
and that kind of the way in which that fluidity and the way it goes between unison and then back out
mm,
uh, into harmony, and then and kind of keeps doing that trick a few times, and it's become something of a almost dare I say a cliche in choral music that we have these moments
yes.
where, but of course Stanford does it an awful lot before Howells. Um, and I wonder if whether there's kind of elements of musical language that you're seeking to continue, because one thing that I really struck me once when you were talking about Howells, I think you said that for you he encompassed virtually everything that had come before. It was that in within choral music, it's the way that it kind of touches upon Tallis, it touches upon chant, it
Yes, yes.
word, and then goes
Mm,
all the way through, has romantic elements, has all sorts of things, but you feel that all of history seems to be present at some point in certain pieces. I think about the Vaughan Williams Tallis Fantasia in a similar way,
yes,
the way that
yes, yes.
touches upon music history. I wonder whether this is, as a composer composing today, is that a kind of state of mind that you recognize, or you think, oh, well, actually, I never intellectualize it like that. I just write music, or um, what is it like to be in the mind of a composer today?
Well, whenever I hear, well, first of all, whenever I hear Bach, and I often listen to Bach before 7 on Radio 3, if I'm awake in time. Whenever I hear Bach, I think, why do I bother at all? Uh, because it's just such wonderful music. But then I I think I so admire, say, Palestrina, Lassus. I love their wonderful some. There's a Missa. No, it's a Victoria. Missa Pro Victoria. I don't know if you know that. It's very. The chords are very very simple, and the elements I like. Uh, there are those wonderful pieces are very much in my mind when I'm composing, and when you get, for instance, in the Missa Brevis of Palestrina, the last Agnus Dei with the trebles in canon. I think it's the trebles in canon, isn't it? I sometimes I like to have a certain amount of voice leading in the pieces I write, partly um, uh, because it's such a wonderful effect, and also I sometimes finish with I have finished on more than one occasion with a fugue. There's a big piece I wrote for Westminster Abbey um, called The King and the Robin, which is recorded, has never been published. It's words by Andrew Motion. Um, and I was asked to write this for an occasion in about 2004. And I finished with a fugue. Um, and that actually is very satisfying. And in fact, there are two other pieces I've written. I did a piece called Hymn to St. Cecilia, um, which is which uses all the forces of the Britten St. Nicholas, two pianos, orchestra, and organ. That finishes with a fugue, and so does the piece I wrote for the Southern Cathedrals Festival, which is recorded actually by Winchester, um, and that also finishes with a fugue. And I think that is a reflection of my admiration not only for Bach but also for the Renaissance, the Tallis and Palestrina and Bird and so forth.
That's
Um,
interesting because I thought you would say this is either a Handelian thing because it's such a that or later Walton the
mm,
12 things like
yes, yes.
this kind of the resurrected fugues or Britain of course yeah in orchestral works it's
Yeah, and I think it's actually I think quite satisfying the choir to sing because they just have to learn the few subjects and the rest of it and they've got the notes there and ready made, and it does. I often discipline myself, unlike Howells, to write in four parts only, which is uh, when you look at, say, the St. John Passion, only four-part harmony, Messiah, four-part harmony, apart from Lift Up Your Heads. And I think there are some composers who, um, and I think Howells was probably guilty of this, who slightly overindulge in divisi. Um, but and actually, when it comes to composers like, say, Arvo Pärt or Eric Whittaker, whose music I don't like, basically. If you were organist of Chichester Cathedral, you've only got six men in total. You can't do some of it because it divides so much. And I think some I think Arvo Pärt and people. I'm digressing now. I think they've spawned a whole lot of composers who imitate him, probably rather badly. Um, so that's one of my
it's
pet
interesting that isn't
peeves.
it that Alan Ridout told you off specifically for writing
Yes,
too too much like Howells and I think a lot of often it's a criticism of choral composers that Howells has spawned too many
I
Howells
think he has.
lookalikes.
Yes. Mm,
We tend to hear an awful lot of Howells style music in commissions these days.
yes, yes, we do. Um, Barry Ferguson, I don't know any of his music. He was organist of Rochester Cathedral, and he was a Howells pupil and writes very much in the Howells style. Malcolm Archer um, doesn't so much, but he's a Malcolm's a very good composer, I think. Malcolm writes well. I think he writes well for voices and so forth. So, but
Yeah, it's interesting. You've reminded me of the number of Howell's pupils I've interviewed who've said, "Oh, I took along this piece as my kind of homage to Howells, using a lot of his musical language
mm,
and using forms, for example, that he was very fond of, and then kind of came away feeling like I wish I hadn't because he was quite good at sending people away saying, "Stop trying to write my music." It's kind of a
really,
rather like actually the phrase reminded me of Ravel because Ravel said Vaughan Williams was the only one of my pupils who doesn't write my music. So
that's
um,
right. He did, didn't he?
yeah,
Yes,
and I
yes.
wonder whether Howells
Mm,
was actually purposefully using that phrase with his students because he tended to say, well, actually. I think this is a bit too close. Why don't we look
Mm,
at this late Prokofiev instead? And people go, oh, okay, he's sending me off in quite a different direction. Because I think he absolutely didn't want clones, and
no.
I think this was the trickiness of being allocated Howells, and then yes, trying to do a kind of takeoff.
Which would have happened had I gone to him, most certainly. So I
Yeah.
would have probably ended up writing the same sort of music that I'm writing now, but by a different route. You did I tell you about Francis and Ravel? He was very fond of his music,
Mm.
and he managed to get years before um, customs officials were officious. Um, he and Priscilla went to his house, which I've been to. Have you been to his house? Oh,
No, I haven't.
it was wonderful.
No.
And they managed to pull cuttings of a cherry tree, and they planted it in their garden in East Ackland, which is only about half an hour from here. And it took. So there's a cherry tree from Ravel's garden in Francis's house. Um, but the other thing was, Francis was once asked if Ravel wrote any church music, and he said, "No." He said, "I've written it for him."
Very interesting. Yeah.
Yes, yes,
Yeah, the harmonic style is quite it's interesting. And I remember a few times when Francis improvised,
yes,
thinking that actually there's there's some very interesting things going on in terms of the way that we think of modality is very English, and you immediately think of, and sometimes we think, oh, sounds very Howellsian because it's so modal.
yes,
But I
yes,
wonder whether I think Francis's understanding of that modality was really quite advanced, and for him, it
yes.
was coming from that directly from the French school. He was kind of
Mm,
bypassing Howells. Of course, a lot of these
yes.
influences are influencing Howells as well. But I think Francis was really quite, yeah. Well, I mean, he was very clever in the way that he develops his tonal language. It's really
Oh,
quite
yes.
cool.
Mm.
Rather
And he
rather
could
like
all.
Bairstow actually, because I
Sorry.
rather like Bairstow because I
Yes.
the more that I kind of look at the harmony and really think about what's going on with in so much of his music. I think it was first because I played the organ sonata to Francis. And
Right.
there are
Right.
so many modal moments in that you think
Yes. Yes.
this is particularly that second subject in the first movement, and you think actually I don't think this could be anybody else. I mean, it really is. It's familiar in its kind of modality, but it's also quite distinctive. Um,
Mm.
particularly that second subject in the Minster. I just yeah, it has a very peculiar effect, and
Yes. Yes.
I think
Um,
it's interesting.
I think I mean, Francis could play the left-hand piano concerto with the left hand. He said to me once, I don't play it quite up to speed, but he could. I mean, he was a very, very good pianist. Um, and in his autobiography, he makes it clear that he wasn't geared towards a church music career. I think partly because of the clergy he found a bit difficult. So who doesn't? Although I had fairly good relationships, and the Minster clergy are marvelous now. But and it was only when he was offered, he became Bairstow's assistant when Bairstow was ill, and it was only when he was offered the job that he thought, "My goodness me, what a wonderful opportunity!" So he really sort of sailed into the job when he was he was very young. But
Is there I wonder now you're in this position where you've had, was it, I think you retired in 2008 from the Minster, didn't you? Am I right? Yeah. And you've had more time to compose, and to travel around, and you've had this long professional experience. I mean, I would just wonder how you feel, what your perspective is on the future of cathedral music, and particularly this kind of tradition that Howells spawned in the 20th century. And Are you feeling highly optimistic, or perhaps the opposite, or what is it? I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Arvo Pärt then, because I think it was yesterday was Arvo Pärt's 90th birthday. And I was going back to listening to those recordings with Stephen Layton and things like that, and we've got a lot of quite different styles appearing. If we hear Pärt on the one hand, also kind of very distinctive commissions recently from particularly Judith Weir. I was thinking actually there are lots of different styles I think emerging to take us perhaps a bit further away from that very dominant Howellsian aesthetic. So I just wonder where you think the future of choral composition is going.
I'm not sure where it's going, but certainly listening to pieces that have been written recently, um, I think I think people are becoming um, less aggressive and more traditional in their approach. And when I was last in the Minster, they did some responses by Sarah MacDonald. Very, very nice and um, almost, almost traditional. And there was something else I heard in the Minster by it was last Friday we went to Evensong, and I can't remember the name of the composer now. She was an American, but I thought this is not the sort of piece that you would imagine was going to be written today. When you look at, say, the pieces that were being written by Jonathan Harvey or Tippett, this is almost a reversion to um, harmonies that actually um, where the ear can follow. I think one of my problems with some modern music is the ear gets lost. What's happening? Um, and this is a diversion. But one of the things I love about, say, Vaughan Williams' Fourth Symphony is that although it's percussive and deeply modern in the harmony, you can hear what the music is doing. The ear doesn't get lost. Um, whereas I think with certain pieces, um, I mean, the Jonathan Harvey Magnificat and Emeritus, I never dared to do. But my ear was, I thought, what on earth is going on? And he's a very interesting composer, but I think, um, but I think there are pieces where you can't tell um, at all what's happening. And but as far as the future of English church music is concerned, or this country, I think it's amazing. We lived through two world wars, and then we had the pandemic. And during the pandemic, I was thankful I was not in charge of a cathedral choir anymore. But we've come through that, and that's I think is extraordinary, the way that people have managed to do so, because the efforts that they had to go to were incredible. They had these Zoom choir practices when you couldn't hear what people were doing, and it would have driven me mad. I would have had to do it, and I would have done it. Um, but I so admire the way in which people fought through and came out at the other end with the difficulties. The choirs are possibly smaller. I mean, York doesn't have so many children now, but they're still singing extremely well. And so other choirs are as well. So
I think that's a wonderfully positive note to end on. Thank you so much for speaking to me today. It's been really fascinating and wonderful to have the views of someone who is not only has had such an amazing career as a choral conductor, but also is a composer, and it's a really unique perspective, I think. So I'm really looking forward to the autobiography.
thank you very much indeed. But I better get on with it now.
Excellent.
Lovely to see you, and it was a great honor to be able to talk to you.